April 12, 1861. It is still dark over Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. On a small island in the middle of the water sits Fort Sumter, a federal military outpost surrounded by Confederate gun positions. At 4:30 in the morning, a single mortar round arcs across the sky. Then the batteries open fire. Shell after shell slams into the fort's brick walls. Explosions echo across the harbor. Smoke rises into the dawn. The bombardment continues for 34 hours. The garrison inside, outnumbered and running low on ammunition, finally surrenders. No soldiers die in the fighting, but what has just started will kill more Americans than any war before or since. Over the next 4 years, more than 620,000 soldiers will die. Cities will burn to the ground. Entire armies will be destroyed. A president will be shot dead in the theater. The United States of America, a nation not yet 90 years old, will come closer to tearing itself apart than at any other point in its history. But how did it come to this? How did a country built on the promise of liberty end up at war with itself? The answer had been building for generations. At the center of it all was slavery. By the middle of the 19th century, the American South had built its entire economy around enslaved labor. Millions of African Americans worked under brutal conditions on cotton, tobacco, and sugar plantations. The wealth of Southern landowners depended on this system. In the North, the picture was different. Slavery had been gradually abolished. Cities were growing. Factories and railroads were expanding. Two very different societies were developing inside the same country, and the tension between them was increasing with every passing year. For decades, politicians in Washington tried to hold the nation together through compromise. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew a line across the map, separating slave territories from free ones. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state while tightening laws forcing the return of escaped enslaved people. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 let settlers in new territories vote on whether to allow slavery, sparking violent confrontations that gave the territory the name Bleeding Kansas. Every compromise bought time. None of them solved the problem, and each one left both sides more bitter than before. Then came the breaking point. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election. He was the candidate of the new Republican Party, which opposed the spread of slavery into new territories. Lincoln did not carry a single Southern state. For many in the South, his victory was unacceptable. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to leave the Union. By February 1861, 6 more states had followed. Together, they formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated in March, the country was already splitting apart. And then Fort Sumter fell. The war had begun. After the attack, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. In response, 4 more states joined the Confederacy, including Virginia, just across the river from Washington. Flags went up on both sides. Young men lined up to enlist. Crowds cheered soldiers as they marched through the streets. In the North and the South, people believed the war would be short. A few months, maybe one big battle, and it would be over. Few people realized what was about to happen. In July 1861, the two sides met for the first time in a major battle near Manassas, Virginia, along a creek called Bull Run. Union troops advanced with confidence, pushing the Confederates back. But on a hill overlooking the battlefield, a Confederate brigade under Thomas Jackson held its ground under heavy fire. A fellow officer reportedly called out that Jackson was standing like a stone wall. The name stuck. Jackson's stand rallied the Confederate line. Reinforcements arrived. The Union attack collapsed. Soldiers broke and ran. The retreat turned into chaos, a disorganized flood of men, horses, and wagons streaming back toward Washington. Mixed in with them were civilians, men and women from the capital who had traveled to the battlefield with picnic baskets, expecting to watch a quick and glorious victory. Instead, they witnessed panic, confusion, and defeat. The illusion of a short war was gone. Both sides began preparing for something much larger. The Union developed what became known as the Anaconda Plan: squeeze the Confederacy with a naval blockade, seize control of the Mississippi River to cut the South in two, and drive toward Richmond, the Confederate capital. The Confederacy's plan was simpler, but calculated: defend their territory, make the war long and costly enough to break Northern willingness to fight, and win support from Britain and France, whose textile mills relied on Southern cotton. The commanders who rose on each side would define the conflict. George McClellan built the Union's Army of the Potomac into a disciplined fighting force, but he was painfully slow to use it. Ulysses S. Grant, fighting in the West, was the opposite: aggressive, direct, and willing to absorb losses to achieve results. William Tecumseh Sherman would later take the war to a level of destruction no one anticipated. On the Confederate side, Robert E. Lee combined tactical brilliance with a willingness to take enormous risks. His partnership with Stonewall Jackson created one of the most effective command teams of the war. The weapons had also changed. Rifled muskets made infantry fire accurate at distances that would have been impossible a generation earlier. Artillery tore through formations. Railroad networks moved troops and supplies at unprecedented speed. Telegraph lines carried orders across hundreds of miles. In March 1862, two ironclad warships, the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, fought to a draw in Hampton Roads, signaling the end of wooden naval warfare. And it was about to become far worse. In April 1862, Grant's forces clashed with Confederate troops near a small church called Shiloh in the forests of western Tennessee. The Confederates attacked at dawn, catching Union soldiers off guard. For 2 days, men fought at close range through dense woods. Musket fire cut through the trees. Artillery shells exploded in the underbrush. The wounded lay in rows beneath the trees, many waiting hours or days for medical attention. Field hospitals overflowed. When it was over, more than 23,000 men on both sides had been killed, wounded, or were missing. It was the bloodiest battle in American history up to that point. Grant held the field, but the scale of the slaughter stunned the nation. In the East, McClellan launched a massive campaign to take Richmond by advancing up the Virginia Peninsula. His army came within miles of the Confederate capital, but in late June, Robert E. Lee, newly in command, counterattacked in a series of engagements known as the 7 Days Battles. Day after day, fighting raged across fields and swamps east of Richmond. Lee's forces took heavy casualties but kept attacking, and McClellan, shaken, ordered a retreat. Richmond was saved. In August, Lee won again at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and suddenly the momentum belonged entirely to the Confederacy. Lee then made his boldest move yet. He marched his army north, crossing into Maryland. If he could win a major victory on Union soil, it might shatter Northern morale and force Lincoln to negotiate. On September 17, 1862, the two armies met near the town of Sharpsburg along Antietam Creek. What followed would change the war forever. From dawn until dark, the battle raged across cornfields, sunken roads, and stone bridges. Waves of men charged into concentrated fire. Entire regiments were torn apart in minutes. In a sunken farm road later known as Bloody Lane, soldiers fought at point-blank range, climbing over the bodies of the fallen to keep firing. Smoke was so thick that officers could barely see their own men. By nightfall, roughly 22,000 soldiers on both sides were dead, wounded, or missing. It remains the single bloodiest day in American history. Lee's invasion was stopped. He withdrew south. Antietam was not a decisive tactical victory for either side, but it gave Lincoln the moment he needed. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free. The proclamation did not immediately reach those behind enemy lines, but it changed the meaning of the war. What had begun as a fight to preserve the Union was now also a fight to end slavery. Across the North, tens of thousands of formerly enslaved men volunteered to serve. By the end of the war, approximately 180,000 black soldiers had fought in the Union Army, serving in combat, garrison duty, and support roles. Their service proved essential to the Union cause. Overseas, the proclamation ended any realistic chance that Britain or France would recognize the Confederacy. Supporting the South now meant defending slavery in the eyes of the world. By 1863, the war had already killed tens of thousands of Americans, but the worst battles were still ahead. The battlefield remained brutal. At Fredericksburg in December 1862, Union troops launched wave after wave of frontal assaults against entrenched Confederate positions on high ground. Line after line of soldiers marched across open ground into devastating fire. The attacks failed completely. At Chancellorsville in May 1863, Lee pulled off his most daring tactical victory, dividing his smaller force and striking the Union Army from an unexpected direction. But the victory came at a devastating personal cost. In the confusion of fighting in thick woods at dusk, Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men. He died days later. Lee reportedly said, "I have lost my right arm." The summer of 1863 brought the two moments that would decide the war. Emboldened by Chancellorsville, Lee launched a second invasion of the North. His army marched into Pennsylvania. The two forces collided at the small town of Gettysburg on July 1. Over 3 days, the battle grew into the largest and bloodiest engagement of the entire war. On the first day, Confederate forces drove Union troops through the streets of Gettysburg and onto high ground to the south. On the second day, fighting erupted across rocky hills and open fields at Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Wheat Field. Musket fire echoed off the stone walls. Men fought hand-to-hand among the boulders. Union defenders held their positions, but barely. On the third day, Lee ordered a massive assault on the center of the Union line. Roughly 12,500 Confederate soldiers formed up across open fields. Artillery from both sides opened fire. Then the advance began. Thousands of men marched in formation across nearly a mile of open ground, directly into Union cannon and rifle fire. Shells tore gaps in the lines. Men fell in rows. A few Confederate soldiers reached the Union position at a low stone wall, but they were overwhelmed. The attack, known as Pickett's Charge, was a catastrophic failure. Lee's invasion was over. He retreated to Virginia. In 3 days, the two armies had suffered a combined total of nearly 50,000 casualties. At the same time, hundreds of miles to the west, Grant completed a grueling campaign against the Confederate fortress city of Vicksburg, perched on high bluffs above the Mississippi River. After weeks of siege, with the garrison starving and the city under constant bombardment, Vicksburg surrendered on July 4, 1863. The Union now controlled the entire length of the Mississippi. The Confederacy was physically cut in two. After Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the trajectory of the war shifted permanently. The Confederacy would fight on, but from this point forward, it was on the defensive. In March 1864, Lincoln placed Grant in command of all Union armies. Grant's approach was blunt. He would attack on every front, deny the Confederacy time to recover, and use the North's advantages in manpower and industry to grind down what remained of Southern resistance. In May, Grant led the Army of the Potomac into the dense forests of Northern Virginia, beginning the overland campaign against Lee. At the Battle of the Wilderness, men fought in thick woods, so tangled that the undergrowth caught fire, and wounded soldiers trapped in the brush burned alive. At Spotsylvania, soldiers fought for nearly 20 hours over a single fortified position. At Cold Harbor, thousands of Union soldiers fell in less than an hour during a failed frontal assault. The casualties were staggering. But Grant did not retreat. He kept pushing south. By June, Grant had pinned Lee's army at Petersburg, south of Richmond. What followed was a siege lasting nearly 10 months. Miles of trenches stretched across the landscape, prefiguring the trench warfare of the next century. Lee's army, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, slowly weakened. While Grant held Lee in place, Sherman struck deep into the South. After capturing Atlanta in September 1864, Sherman led 60,000 soldiers on a march from Atlanta to the port city of Savannah, cutting a path of destruction roughly 300 miles long and 60 miles wide. His troops tore up railroad tracks, heated the rails over bonfires, and twisted them around trees. They burned warehouses, factories, and cotton gins. They seized livestock and destroyed crops. Farms were stripped bare. Smoke rose from the horizon in every direction. Civilians watched as the war consumed everything around them. Sherman's goal was not just military. It was to break the South's ability and willingness to keep fighting. The march demonstrated that the Confederacy could no longer protect its own territory. Lincoln's re-election in November 1864, bolstered by the fall of Atlanta, guaranteed that there would be no negotiated peace. The war would continue until the Union won completely. By early April 1865, the end came swiftly. On April 2, Union forces broke through the Confederate defenses at Petersburg. Lee's army, exhausted and starving, abandoned the city. That same day, Richmond was evacuated. Confederate officials ordered military supplies destroyed, but the fire spread out of control. Entire blocks of the Confederate capital burned. As Union troops entered the smoldering city, formerly enslaved residents came into the streets to greet them. Lee moved west, hoping to regroup and continue fighting, but Grant's forces pursued relentlessly, blocking roads, capturing supply trains, and closing off every escape route. Lee's army, reduced to a fraction of its former strength, had no path forward. On April 9, 1865, in the parlor of a brick farmhouse at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Robert E. Lee sat across from Ulysses S. Grant to discuss the terms of surrender. Lee wore his finest dress uniform. Grant arrived in a mud-spattered field coat. The terms Grant offered were generous. Confederate soldiers would lay down their arms and go home. Officers could keep their sidearms and personal horses. There would be no mass imprisonments, no executions. Lee accepted. As word of the surrender spread through the Union lines, soldiers began to cheer. Grant ordered them to stop. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." Over the following weeks, remaining Confederate forces across the South surrendered one by one. But what should have been a moment of national healing became something else entirely. 5 days after Appomattox, on the evening of April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington. During the third act, John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate sympathizer, entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house, where doctors attended him through the night. He never regained consciousness. Abraham Lincoln died the following morning, April 15, 1865. Across the North, celebrations turned to silence. Flags that had been raised in victory were lowered to half-staff. Church bells that had rung in triumph now tolled in mourning. Crowds gathered in the streets, many weeping openly. Vice President Andrew Johnson was sworn in as president. The American Civil War was over. Its cost was staggering. More than 620,000 soldiers had died, with some modern estimates placing the total even higher. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded, many permanently disabled. Entire regions of the South lay in physical and economic ruin. The war preserved the Union and settled the question of secession permanently. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery throughout the United States. The 14th and 15th Amendments followed, establishing citizenship and voting rights for formerly enslaved people. During the brief period of Reconstruction, Black Americans in the South gained political representation for the first time, with Black men elected to state legislatures and even to Congress. But this progress met fierce resistance. Within years, Southern states imposed Jim Crow laws, enforcing racial segregation and stripping Black citizens of their newly won rights through violence, intimidation, and legal manipulation. The promise of equality written into the post-war amendments would remain unfulfilled for nearly another century. The American Civil War remains the deadliest conflict in the nation's history. It preserved the United States as one nation. It ended the institution of slavery, but it left wounds and unanswered questions about race, equality, federal power, and national identity that did not end at Appomattox. The Civil War nearly destroyed the United States. It held the Union together and struck down slavery, but left behind contradictions and divisions that the nation would struggle with for generations to come.